Up to now, we've looked at the first 7 chapters of Isaiah. And in the first chapter, we saw that Isaiah was called to point out the hypocrisy of God's covenant bride, to show her that she was interested in all kinds of ceremonies and had lost her first love. And in the second chapter, Isaiah proclaimed the day of the Lord's final judgment, which brings not only death, but also deliverance. So judgment is not just bad, judgment is good and bad, depending on where you fall. And in chapter 3, Isaiah makes clear that God will judge his own people. Many in the world today think that judgment is for the wicked, but judgment, according to Isaiah, is for God's own people. And in chapter 4, it portrayed the glorious results of judgment for God's people, that it will be a cleansing, that it will be a purifying, that it will bring out a remnant people that give glory to God. And in chapter 5 of Isaiah, God gave a picture of his people like a vine in a vineyard. He planted a vine in a fruitful hill in good soil, and that he surrounded it with a fence, that he put a tower in the middle of it, and that he put a wine press there that represents God gave his people a sanctuary that he could dwell among them. He gave them the law to protect them, and he gave them good seed and good soil, but they blew it. They produced bad fruit, and God had to take the vine away from Israel and plant it on the other side of the wall. So that was chapter 5. In chapter 6, Isaiah enters God's presence. And when he enters God's presence, he sees that he also is lacking the perfection that God requires. That he's a man of unclean lips, and a people in the middle of unclean lips, and God forgives his sins and commissions him to carry the message to his rebellious people. And last week in chapter 7, we talked about King Ahaz, and that he was attacked, he was invaded by 2 armies, which were actually his neighbors, Syria and Israel to the north. They were like his neighbors, and his own brothers were attacking him. And God sent Isaiah with a message, and Isaiah's message, together with his son that accompanied him, the message was, you're not going to fight in this battle. Just take it easy and I'll solve everything. But the king didn't accept that message. He went to a northern king of Assyria and said, come fight against my enemies for me. Well, God wasn't satisfied that he didn't accept the first message, so God said, look, I'll not only tell you what not to do, but I'll give you a sign to show you that this is exactly my message. You can ask a sign in the heavens, you can ask a sign in the earth. Maybe you'd like to have an earthquake on the 24th of January in your hometown to prove that it's my message. Whatever you ask, I'll give you. And what did King Ahaz do? He refused that also. So now we come to chapter 8, and in chapter 8 of Isaiah we read in the first 4 verses, moreover the Lord said unto me, take thee a great roll, and write in it with a man's pen concerning Maher-shalal-Hash-baz. And I took unto me faithful witnesses to record Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Jeberechiah. And I went unto the prophetess, and she conceived and bare a son. Then said the Lord to me, call his name Maher-shalal-Hash-baz. For before the child shall have knowledge to cry, my father and my mother, the riches of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria shall be taken away before the king of Assyria. So what he's saying is that you're going to take a big street sign, a big highway sign, and you're going to write in big letters on it, and you're going to write this word in Hebrew, which really means speed the spoil, hasten the plunder. So he's going to write a big sign, speed the spoil, hasten the plunder. That means that it's going to come very quickly. There's going to be a plundering of somebody's army, and it's going to be lots of spoil. And so he writes this on a big plaque, on a big road sign, so everybody can see it. And then he produces the son, and God says, well, now you name that boy the same thing you put on the big sign, speed the spoil, hasten the plunder. And he had witnesses with his writing of the sign to make sure that the king and the nation knew that God meant what he said, and he said exactly which countries are going to be spoiled. The two that were attacking Judah, that was the country of Syria, with Damascus as its capital, and the country of Israel, with Samaria as its capital. And God's trying to tell the king in this third message, I'll take care of them. It's not your responsibility. But the king doesn't listen to that either. So God had made two previous attempts. First say, you don't go fight in this battle, I'll take care of it. Then offer him a sign, and with that sign was a son that said only a remnant will remain, because he went with the first boy at the first sign, saying that there's going to be a remnant even in Judah that will remain. And now with this third sign, he says the spoil will be quickly brought to pass, and your enemies will be defeated. Now, King Ahaz had a great-great-great-great-grandfather named Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat was faced with an enemy army. He was faced with an attacking army that was far outnumbering his troops. And God sent by his prophet in that time a message to that king saying, this battle is not yours, I'm going to take care of it. And when he did what God told him to do, because Jehoshaphat listened to God, in 2 Chronicles 20:20, this is what Ahaz's great-great-great-grandfather concluded. 2 Chronicles 20:20. Hear me, O Judah, and ye inhabitants of Jerusalem. Believe in the Lord your God, so shall ye be established. Believe his prophets, so shall ye prosper. So this message that God had given to the great-great-great-grandfather of Ahaz, he should have had in his mind, and he could have had prosperity if he would have listened to God's prophets. But Ahaz didn't listen to God's prophets, and so prosperity he refused. And the results are given in verses 5 to 8 of Isaiah 8. The Lord spake also unto me, saying, forasmuch as this people refuseth the water of Shiloh, that goes softly and rejoice in Rezin and Remaliah's son, those are the two attacking armies. Now therefore, behold, the Lord bringeth up upon them the waters of the river, strong and many, even the king of Assyria and all his glory, and he shall come over all his channels and go over all his banks. And he shall pass through Judah, he shall overflow and go over, he shall reach even to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land, O Emmanuel. So this is a metaphor. God now is communicating with his people through a metaphor, and he says, now you could have listened to my prophet Isaiah. He is a soft and gentle man. He's like the river here in Judah, the river Shiloh, that moves softly and gently. You could have accepted the message, but because you've refused my message, and you've thought to hire the king of Assyria to defend you against your enemies, now the king of Assyria himself, that great mighty river, the Euphrates River, is going to invade your whole land, and is going to conquer everything in your land, and only a remnant will remain. And he shall pass through Judah, he shall overflow and go over, he shall reach even to the neck, and the stretching out of his wings shall fill the breadth of thy land. So God tells him what's going to be the results of having gone and hired the king of Assyria, Tiglath-Pileser, to come and defend him against his enemies. And to hire Tiglath-Pileser, he had to take all the treasure out of the sanctuary. He had to take treasure out of his own house and give them to him. And now he's going to find out that the same Tiglath-Pileser is going to come and invade even the land of Judah. And verses 9 and 10 of chapter 8 of Isaiah say, associate yourselves, O ye people, and ye shall be broken in pieces. And give ear, all ye of far countries, gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken in pieces. Gird yourselves, and ye shall be broken in pieces. Take counsel together, and it shall come to naught. Speak the word, and it shall not stand, for God is with us. So here God is speaking to the two powers, Syria and Israel, the two attacking powers to the north. And he says, you guys may get together and form a coalition. You may associate yourselves, form a confederacy, and say, we're going to attack and we're going to destroy God's people. But it won't work because God is with his people. God is going to preserve a remnant, like he told one of the kings prior to Ahaz, that when all the children of the king were destroyed but one, he said, but I will not allow this one to be destroyed, because I promised David, my servant, that there would always be a king on his throne. So the seed of David is the reason why God preserves a remnant in his people. And that seed is Jesus. Just like Galatians says that God made promises to Abraham and to his seed. Not seeds as of many, but to thy seed, which is Jesus Christ. So Jesus is the reason why God is preserving a remnant here in Judah. And Jesus is the recipient of all the promises of God. Like it says in 2 Corinthians, all the promises of God are yea and amen in Jesus. So if we're in Jesus, we're going to be the preserved remnant. Now, passing to the second portion, we've done a review and we've looked at the prophetic prosperity, that if you believe God's prophets, you'll prosper. Now let's look at verses 11 through 18 that talk about signs and fears. And these verses say this: For the Lord spake thus to me with a strong hand, and instructed me that I should not walk in the way of this people, saying, Say ye not a confederacy to all them to whom this people shall say a confederacy. Neither fear ye their fear, nor be afraid. Sanctify the Lord of hosts himself, and let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. And he shall be for a sanctuary, but for a stone of stumbling, and for a rock of offense to both the houses of Israel, for a gin, and for a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And many among them shall stumble and fall, and be broken, and be snared, and taken. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples, and I will wait upon the Lord, that hideth his face from the house of Jacob, and I will look for him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for signs and wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion. So Isaiah's name means Jehovah will save. And one boy's name says a remnant will remain, and the other boy's name says the spoil is coming very quickly. So there's signs and wonders. Each of these guys, by their names, are a sign, a message, right everywhere they walk among the people of Judah. And names in the Bible have great significance. There was a young man in Jesus' day named Nathaniel, and Jesus said, well, he is a boy that is a sincere believer, but we also find he was a bit sarcastic. He said, what good thing could come out of Nazareth? So names like Nathaniel, meaning a gift from God, have meaning in the Bible. And Isaiah means Jehovah will save. His first boy means a remnant will remain. His second boy, the spoil is coming quickly. And in these verses then, 11 through 18, we're looking at the idea of signs. And God especially told Isaiah not to walk in the way of his nation. And what were they doing? They were talking about confederacies. Let's team up with the Assyrians and we'll be successful. Instead of making God their fear, they were making human beings their trust and their fear, what they confided in. But God wanted Isaiah and his people to fear him. And so it says, sanctify the Lord of hosts, and let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. What does the word sanctify mean? Sanctify means to set apart. So that means you give God a special place in your life. You set him apart, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that is to set God apart in a special place. To fear means to make him the one that you are careful not to offend. Is God your fear? Then you're making him the person that you're most interested in not offending. You may have a brother, you may have a wife, you may have a husband, you may have a child that you don't want to offend, but God says, put me in that special place to be afraid, to be careful not to offend me. So God's proper place in our lives is a place of, and it says here, this is what he will be, and he shall be for a sanctuary, for a stone of stumbling, and for a rock of offense. So a sanctuary is a dwelling place, and God then says, I'm going to be, if you give me the place that I deserve in your life, I'm going to be a dwelling place. I'm going to dwell among you. I'm going to be God with you. I'm going to be Emmanuel. I'll be a sanctuary. But not only that, if I dwell among you, I'm going to be a stumbling stone. Because unless you walk in my precepts, you're going to stumble and you're going to trip. And so it is a place of refuge and a stumbling stone. And Isaiah's work was to get his people to give God his proper place. And how was he supposed to do that? Well, the next verse tells us, after it says in verse 15, and many among them shall stumble and fall and be broken and snared and taken. That's if you don't keep Christ and God in his proper place, then you'll stumble and fall and be taken. But how is Isaiah to keep the people attitude toward God correct? Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples. So here are phrases that are used a lot in the Bible, but let's just change them a little bit. And let's say, when it says, seal the law among my disciples, that's the Ten Commandments. That's the law. And the testimony, you can find in Revelation and other parts of the Bible, that's the message about Jesus. That's the message about salvation. So we have the law and the gospel. Just like in Revelation 14, verse 12, it says, here is the patience of the saints, here that keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. Law and gospel. And that's what Isaiah was supposed to teach. Not just the law. If you teach just the law and have no gospel, you'll be falling off the ditch on the side of legalism. If you teach just the gospel and not the law, you'll fall in a ditch on the side of antinomianism. But he was to teach the law and the gospel, and that would keep God in his proper place. And I will wait upon the Lord that hideth his face from the house of Jacob. I will look for him. And then he says, our names are signs to the people. So we've considered signs and fears, that Isaiah and his sons were signs to the people, and that the real position the people should take is not confederacy, not trying to join with your neighbors to form a coalition, but rather to fear God, who is omnipotent and omniscient. He knows just what's best for us, and he has the power to bring it to pass. So in the last section of Isaiah chapter 8, we want to look at law and gospel, which we just said he's supposed to teach according to verse 16. And now let's look at verses 19 to 22 of Isaiah 8. And when they shall say unto you, so this is God people are going to say to the prophet Isaiah, they're going to say, hey, this is what you need to do. Here's the special technique that's going to help you in your ministry. And when they shall say unto you, seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto wizards that peep and that mutter, should not a people seek unto their God for the living, to the dead, to the law and to the testimony? If they speak not according to this word, it is because there is no light in them. And they shall pass through it, hardly be stead and hungry. And it shall come to pass that when they shall be hungry, they shall fret themselves and curse their king and their God and look upward. And they shall look unto the earth and behold trouble and darkness, dimness of anguish, and they shall be driven to darkness. So what does this portion say? This portion is saying that the people are going to say, Isaiah, you need to consult with familiar spirits. You need to consult with, and you could think of all the things that God has named in Deuteronomy. In Deuteronomy chapter 18, there's a list of some of these things and God's attitude toward them. Reading from verse 9 of Deuteronomy 18, it says, when thou art come into the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, thou shalt not learn to do after the abominations of the nation. So he's going to list here some abominations, and you might think of them as Ouija boards and horoscopes. Well, here's the way God outlines them. There shall not be found among you anyone that maketh his son or daughter to pass through the fire, or that useth divination, or an observer of time, or an enchanter, or a witch, or a charmer, or a consulter of familiar spirits, or a wizard, or a necromancer. For all that do these things are an abomination unto the Lord, and because of these abominations, the Lord thy God doth drive them out from before thee. Thou shalt be perfect with the Lord thy God. For these nations which thou shalt possess hearken unto observers of time, and unto diviners. But as for thee, the Lord thy God hath not suffered thee to do so. The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, and of thy brethren, like unto me, unto him he shall hearken. So God was telling his people all those things that the people were going to tell Isaiah, seek unto familiar spirits and wizards that peep and that mutter, that use different forms of communication, that was not the route he should go. And he then repeats what the route that Isaiah should go is. And here is the test for every spirit, because there are good spirits and there are bad spirits. There are divinely sent spirits, messengers, and there are devil-sent spirits, messengers. And how are we to judge? Well, here is the universal principle given in the Bible, and it says in verse 20 of Isaiah 8, to the law and to the testimony. If they speak not according to this word, it's because there is no light in them. You want to test the spirits? Take the Ten Commandments. Do they speak in accord with them? Take the gospel. Are they in harmony with the gospel that Jesus came and lived a perfect life and kept all the Ten Commandments as our substitute and surety? And that this perfect righteousness is offered to all those that believe? If they're not in harmony with the gospel, or if they're not in harmony with the law, then they're not a spirit sent from God. And in 1 John, the same idea is brought up in chapter 4 and verses 1 and onward, in 1 John 4, it says, Beloved, believe not every spirit, but try the spirits, whether they are of God, because many false prophets are gone out into the world. Hereby know ye the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesseth that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God. And every spirit that confesseth not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God. And this is the spirit of Antichrist, whereof ye have heard that it should come, and even now already is in the world. So we are to test the spirits, and we have the law and the gospel. We have the incarnate Christ, and that testimony given in the New Testament, the gospel messages that give us the way to test, using the law and the gospel, any messenger that claims to come from God. But let's say that you do. Let's say that you have consulted with spirits, with spirits of the dead, with Ouija boards, with horoscopes. What will be the result if you put your confidence in those kind of sources? And so the last two verses of Isaiah 8 tell us what will be the results of consulting with what some call the dead. And it says, And they shall pass through it, hardly be stead, and hungry. And it shall come to pass that when they shall be hungry, they shall fret themselves and curse their king and their God and look upward. So there's going to be a lack. There's going to be a discouragement. There's going to be lack of spiritual food in your life. And they shall look unto the earth and behold trouble and darkness. There's going to be despair, despondency for those who seek counsel from these evil spirits. They shall look unto the earth and behold trouble and darkness, dimness and anguish, and they shall be driven to darkness. Oh, the despair that comes to those who have sought counsel from evil spirits. So we've seen in the chapter 8 of Isaiah, signs and wizards. We've looked at the prophetic prosperity that comes to those who believe God's prophets. Has God sent a message to you by his prophets? If you reject it, you can expect to have the results like Ahaz had, have invasion of foreign forces in your life. And then we looked at signs and fears that Isaiah and his children were signs, continually bringing to mind to God's people God's will, God's message, and that they should fear God and not try to form a confederacy and look for human aid to support them in the crisis, but to look to God. And then we ended up looking at the law and the gospel is the way that we can find our guidance and determine the spirits that come to us. So we should ask ourselves, what is it in the evangelical world today that opens the door for these seances, for these familiar spirits to communicate with God's people? Well, there's a particular doctrine that's universal almost in all evangelical churches that believe in the natural immortality of the soul. The natural immortality of the soul. Natural means that we're born with it. Natural immortality. That means we're born with it, and what we're born with is eternal life. You may live forever in heaven or with God, or you may live forever without God, but you will never die. And if that's the case, then it opens the door that the dead, when your loved ones die, that they're not really dead, that they can still think, they can still communicate, and so this doctrine of natural immortality opens the door for seances and communication with evil spirits. Because the devil comes in and fills the void, like it says in 1 Corinthians 10, that he comes and fills the void if you worship some of these idols, and he comes and sends his evil spirits to communicate, and they have power, and they have results. And so that life to life, as it says in 2 Corinthians. And that hope is only for those in Christ. Those outside of Christ will not live forever. They will be destroyed and exist no more. And we also want to mention what should we do as a result of the clear instruction that we're given in chapter 8 of Isaiah. It should push us, it should move us to study the law of God with more careful attention and to meditate continually on the gospel of grace, that in Jesus the law has been perfectly fulfilled, and in him we have a righteousness that meets God's every demand. And that, like Isaiah, if we accept the mercy of God, the forgiveness of sins, we are accepted and accepted in the beloved. May God direct our thoughts in that direction.